All right. Just setting up. Hi, Ronit. How are you doing? It's nice to see that I'm hanging out with one person at least. I'm just getting set up, so get comfortable. I am doing well. How are you, Ronit? There's Avi. Avi's got a question. All right, Avi, I'm going to wait just a moment. I will get set up and then I'll get started on questions. And I will gladly explain waterways. Yep, no problem. You're not the only one who has a hard time understanding it, so I will gladly go over it for you. Just give me a moment till set up, drink a little bit of carrot juice. All right. Avi, how are you doing? I'm glad you and Ronit are both here. There's Ria. Hi, Ria. Can we go over differences between biomagnification and bioaccumulation? Absolutely. I see Stefan's here too. Parent-offspring conflict. Okay, no problem. All right, everybody. Hi. Let's see how many people we got. Looks like there are 12 of us here. Okay, so I'm going to get started. Hi, Jonathan. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start with, let's see, Avi's question about explaining waterways a little more. So here's the deal with waterways. When you think about, I think when I think about it, when I think about how to start it and how to make it make sense in my head, I start thinking about, where does water go from a house? So we talked about in class that in my house, it goes to a septic tank, but in a lot of houses in Cupertino or in the Bay Area, it goes from your house to a waste, or first to sewer system and then to a wastewater treatment plant. And then from there, it goes to the estuary, right? And then from the estuary, you have water that's getting evaporated and it's going to go up. And that's where the natural water cycle starts. So you're going to go evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and then that water is going to come down basically into everything. But we don't want to draw arrows from precipitation to everything. So let's just go over a few things. Let's talk about reservoirs. So what exactly is a reservoir? It's basically an area, it's like a watershed where all this water is collecting into one place, and humans build a dam and we collect that water and then we can use it for use. Now, the water from a reservoir is eventually going to go into a water treatment plant. And then from there, it's going to go to homes and businesses. So how do reservoirs get filled? Well, they get filled through rivers and just precipitation on the reservoir itself. But typically the reservoir, the watershed, is sort of the lowest part of an area, like a bowl, and all this water is coming into it from nearby mountains or hills. Besides that, remember that there are some rivers that take water to the estuary. And so that's more related to
storm drains. So when we dump something in a storm drain, it's going to go into the SF estuary, or it's going to go into a river and then to the SF estuary. One thing that's really important that I want everyone to know, an area of focus here, is non-point source pollution. Make sure you understand non-point source pollution. Remember, it has to do with indirect. So hi Roma, I see you joined us too. So basically, if I'm on a boat in the estuary and I'm just dumping my garbage, that would be point source pollution, because you know exactly where it's coming from. So if there's a ship and it's spilling all kinds of oil, you know exactly where that oil is coming from. It's from that ship. It's point source pollution. Now, non-point source is indirect. So for example, if I wash my car with really nasty stuff in my driveway, and that nasty stuff ends up getting washed into the nearby, let's say, creeks, and that ends up taking it into the estuary or into Monterey Bay. So that's a form of non-point source pollution, because they won't know who is that guy, who is that bio teacher who ended up washing his car in the driveway. That's not known. So that makes it indirect. Okay. I hope that helps a little bit, Avi. Let me know if you have more questions. All right. Let's see. I'm going to read down the questions. Can we go over the difference between biomagnification and bioaccumulation? Yes, Ria, absolutely. Okay. Biomagnification. Remember the ratio we talked about in class. So if you're starting with, say, 10,000 kilojoules of energy in the producer level, each time something consumes that, it's going to get 10% of the energy. But the amount of toxin, whether it's DDT or mercury or whatever it is, that amount is going to stay the same throughout the system. Now, when you compare the ratio of a primary consumer to the ratio of a quaternary consumer, you see that they're different. And that difference right there explains biomagnification. It's this idea that as it's going through a system, it's actually magnifying, so getting bigger, the amount of toxin in those organisms, because energy is decreasing and the toxin staying the same. That's where we have magnification. All right, Ria. In addition to that, I would say bioaccumulation is this idea that no one organism eats only one other organism. So if I'm in a system and I have lots of mercury in the, let's say, the aquatic animals or fish or whatever. So if I'm eating a lot of fish that have a toxin in them, I'm not just eating one, right? I'm eating many of them. And so I'm constantly accumulating. So the word accumulation is to build up. So I'm constantly building up more of that toxin in my body. So bioaccumulation is the idea that an organism is not just going to have one thing that it eats, one organism that it eats. It's going to eat many of them, and that's going to accumulate. All right, Ria, let me know if that was helpful or if I confused you more. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful. Let's go down to Stefan. Hi, Stefan. A clear explanation of the parent-offspring conflict. I will give you an explanation. I don't know if it will be clear, but I'll give you an explanation. So parent-offspring conflict is this idea that, let's see, the parents of an organism may have issues raising that organism, right? So there are some species, some organisms where the parents and the offspring may have some kind of conflict. So it could be a bird that doesn't want to raise its own babies, and it goes and drops them off somewhere else. It could be an animal that wants to eat its own babies. So it's basically the opposite of parental investment, which is one of the other ones, parental care and investment, which is one of the other topics that we had. Okay, I hope that was helpful, Stefan. Let's see, Roma, could we also go over the natural water cycle? Yes, Roma, absolutely. So the natural water cycle, that's when you have evaporation. All right, remember the word transpiration also. Transpiration is evaporation of water from leaves, from plants. So we have evaporation that goes up to the atmosphere, and then what do we get? We get condensation. So it all condenses, forms clouds, and then we get precipitation, which could be rain, snow, hail, any of those, right? So it's that cycle. What's really interesting about that cycle is that it gives us the impression that water is a reusable resources, right? It's a renewable resource. The issue with that is, yeah, water is a renewable resource, but drinkable water is not necessarily a renewable resource. So keep that in mind too. Okay, let's go to Ronit. Elaborate and explain monogamy versus polygamy. Definitely. So it's basically the idea of how many mates an organism is going to have during its lifetime. So monogamy is the idea that an organism is going to have just one mate throughout its lifetime, or one mate at a time. Polygamy is the idea that an organism is going to have many mates that it's going to mate with and have offspring with. So that's the difference between monogamy and polygamy. All right. Next one. Ria, parental care and investment. Okay, so parental care and investment. It's this idea that the parents of an offspring take care of it, and it's different for lots of different organisms and species. So look at humans. How much time, how much investment do we have into our offspring, right? So when you typically look at kind of, it's about 18 years that kids stay with their parents. There's a ton of investment, whether it's financial or your time as a parent. There are other species that don't spend a whole lot of time caring for their young. And it's this idea of how much time will parents spend taking care of their young, and it's different for different species. So like I was saying earlier to Stefan, it's sort of the opposite of what was it? Parent-offspring conflict. All right. By the way, my dogs have decided to join our study session as well. So I have Kuchuk laying down over here somewhere. Hi, Kuchuk. And Dakota is somewhere trying to bark at squirrels, I think. All right, let's keep going. So let's see. Jonathan, the toxin doesn't change from going to another level, right? No, the toxin stays the same, Jonathan. That toxin is going to stay the same the whole way. But the fact that the energy level is decreasing means that it's magnifying throughout the system, right? So toxins staying the same, energy levels decreasing. So we see that as magnification, and that's why we have our upside down triangle with the trophic levels. Okay. All right, Ria, go over associative learning. Definitely. All right, so associative learning is this idea, like with Kuchuk laying down right here. It's kind of funny. I wish one of these days I'll show you guys what she does when I bust out a piece of fruit or vegetable. She's all about it. So on my cutting board, right, when she was a puppy, I would cut fruits and vegetables, and then I would give her some of it. So she hears that sound of a cutting board and she thinks food, dad's going to give me food. So in her brain, there's a link now between the sound of a cutting board and Kuchuk getting food. That's the idea behind associative learning. Okay, so it's like Pavlov's dog ringing the bell and the dog would salivate. It's that same idea. Okay, I hope that helps, Ria. Let's go to Ronit. Can we have a brief explanation of energy flow through a system? Yeah, definitely, Ronit. So that's where the 10% rule comes in. So remember that as organisms, let's think of a food chain. They're eating each other, right? You have organism, you have a producer, you have a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, a tertiary consumer, and each time that it moves through the system, only 10% of that energy gets passed on, right? So what I'd really like for you all to be able to answer is what happens to the other 90%? That's the really important part. So yeah, 10% gets passed on, but what about the other 90%? And I want you to know that that's energy that's spent on metabolism, on homeostasis, on all these body processes. And so the organism that ends up getting the 10%, that's 10% that it has to use for other things. All right, let's see. I'm going to try to keep up with your awesome questions that are coming. Hi, Jenna. Can we go over DDT and its side effects? Okay, so here's what I want you to know about DDT. I'm not going to quiz you a whole lot on DDT. I just use it as an example to just teach you about different examples of toxins. But just know that toxins can actually be pretty harmful, and each toxin is different in its own way. So they do, unfortunately, remain in our fatty tissue, and they all could do different things, right? So some of them could be harmful to our nervous system, and it really depends on the organism too. So something like DDT for birds is going to damage their ability to make these thick eggshells. For us, we don't have eggshells, so it's not going to do that to us. So each toxin is going to be different. So really try to focus on the toxin and how it stays in your fatty tissue, and how the toxin basically magnifies itself or accumulates throughout a system. Focus on that much more than just kind of the effects of DDT, because I won't be too worried about that on tomorrow's quiz. Okay, Stefan, when does something biotic become abiotic? Ooh, great question. I want you to see biotic and abiotic just as, let's go back to the characteristics of life. So look at whether it is biotic based on those 8 characteristics that we have. So, and I've written them here too, because I think it's important to be able to go through all of them with you. I'm not sure if you're going to want me to go through all of them, but if you do, I'd be happy to. But basically, I think what you might be referring to, Stefan, is this idea that, we talked about in class how some things are biotic, some things are abiotic. Like if it comes from an animal, it's biotic, right? So we even talked about, I think, like if I'm walking with Kuchuk, if I'm hiking with her and we see the dead skull of a different animal, is that biotic or abiotic? The rule of thumb is if it comes from a living thing, it's biotic. But for the purpose of what we're doing for tomorrow's quiz, I really want you to focus on the 8 characteristics of life much more than sort of that rule of thumb that we just talked about. All right. So hi, Nika. Can you just quickly go over homeostasis? Absolutely. So homeostasis is one of the 8 characteristics of life. And it is basically our ability to maintain an internal, stable internal environment. So I'll give you an example that we'll go over later on in the school year, but basically our blood sugar levels. So think about when, so I haven't eaten dinner yet, but let's say, when I eat dinner, what's going to happen? All that food in my system is getting broken down. It's getting broken down into glucose. I don't want a bunch of glucose kind of just in my blood vessels. So my body's going to take that glucose and it's basically going to put it where it needs to go. And then I probably won't eat again until tomorrow morning after dinner tonight. So tomorrow morning when I wake up, I'm probably going to feel kind of hungry. And that's when my body kicks in, and my body basically takes all that glucose and it starts to bring up my blood sugar. So my blood sugar is constantly being maintained by my body itself, and it's not something that I'm thinking about, it's just happening. So there are a lot of processes like that in the human body, and that's the idea behind homeostasis. I hope that is helpful. All right, Ria, can we go over altruism and kin selection? Absolutely, after I have a little drink of carrot juice. Okay, so altruism is basically species wanting to, like, think about this. An altruistic behavior is when you want to help somebody out. So let's say that you're walking home and you see a dog that's lost and you feel bad and you're like, I want this dog to go to a home. I want to find this dog his home or her home. So that's an altruistic behavior on your part. It's when you do something to help another organism out. Kin selection is a little different. So kin selection is this idea that you're gonna, the thought is the same. You're gonna help out, right? But you're helping because ultimately that help is going to result in your genes, not necessarily your own genes, but maybe your family's genes or even your species genes getting passed on, right? So kin selection is this idea that you're helping out, and maybe you're helping out because you're an amazing human being, but it doesn't count as altruism, because ultimately if you say like, throw yourself in front of a bus and save someone, right? Someone might ask, is that altruistic or is that kin selection? So if you're helping to pass on your genes, whether it's yours or your family's or your species, that's going to be kin selection. So altruistic behavior usually has to do between different species. All right. So let's go. Ria says, what's the difference between a decomposer and a detritivore? All right, Ria. So a detritivore is something that's going to feed on things that are dead, right? Like vultures. They're going to go after things that have died already, and they'll just try to eat those things and get energy from those things. And then, they'll go after a dead carcass, basically. Oh, there's Coda. There's Coda barking at a squirrel. Whereas a decomposer, like, oh, hi, Kuchuki, you're fine. You're fine. You're fine. Ignore your brother. So a decomposer is going to be like the worms that I talked about in class, worms, bacteria, things that really break down dead matter into the smallest pieces, right? So there are things that are going to basically take it to a point where there's really nothing left of it, right? The process of decomposing is like the last step in something existing in a physical form. All right, Stefan, repeat your first question about the parent-offspring conflict. I had some difficulties with my computer. No problem, Stefan. How about this? Let me go over it real quick, and then if you want to check it out again when this live, whatever you call it, is over, you can listen to it again. But basically, parent-offspring conflict is when there's an issue between parent and their offspring. And it could be a variety of issues, whether it's the parent doesn't want to take care of the offspring or raise the offspring, or there's some kind of problem where the parent wants to eat the offspring. So those are the different things that we talked about. Okay. Ria, what is the difference between a food chain and a food web? I appreciate all these questions coming in, by the way. You all keep them coming. Difference between a food chain and a food web. A food chain is it's linear, it's pretty simplistic, and it's not realistic. So it just shows a line that goes between, it's what we did in class when I showed you my amazing art. So it's when there's say a producer and a primary consumer and a secondary consumer and a tertiary consumer and so on and so forth. A food web is a much more realistic depiction of what it looks like in real life. So you have lots of producers, you have lots of primary consumers, lots of secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and so on and so forth. All right, Arnav, explain how aqueducts fit into the man-made water cycle. Absolutely. Okay, so aqueducts, it's basically a way. Hi, Dakota. Dakota's here, everybody. I'm going to try to show you what Dakota looks like. I don't know if you can see Dakota. Hi, Dakota. And there's Kuchuk down there. Hi, Kuchuk. All right. I got to get back to work. Okay, so what was I talking about? Aqueducts. So aqueducts are basically, imagine a half pipe, right? So it's a really huge half pipe of water that's being transported from one place to another. So if you've ever been in the car when you've driven to Southern California, you've probably seen an aqueduct. I think it's on the left-hand side when you're going south, and it's basically carrying lots of water. Yeah, that's the job of an aqueduct. And it's man-made because we created them to make sure that different regions get the water they need. Okay, Stefan, what percentage of energy consumed by an organism is dispersed as heat? So, Stefan, what we talk about is that 90% of the energy that an organism gets is going to be used up for processes and dispersed as heat. So we don't really break it down into like this much for heat, this much for metabolism, this much for homeostasis. We say 90% for all of those things. So it's much more vague. So I don't really have a specific response for you. Okay, Roma, give a brief definition of metabolism. Definitely. So metabolism is basically cellular respiration. It's when you eat stuff and your body takes all the stuff that you're consuming and it breaks it down into smaller pieces and ultimately breaks it down into glucose. So that's metabolism. Okay. Ronit, detritivores. So we just talked about detritivores. I'll just say real quick, detritivores are organisms that go after things that are dead, organisms that are dead. So like a vulture that goes after something that's died and it tries to get energy by eating the thing that's already died. So they don't actually they're not predators, right? Because predators actually try to kill something. Okay, Arnav, missed a few of the first questions. Repeat the answer to what is parental. So parental care and investment. Arnav, I'm going to have you watch the video again if you don't mind, since we've talked about it. I want to make sure I get to the rest of the questions. If nothing else comes up, then let's definitely go over it again. Ria, can we go over how living organisms respond to stimuli? Yeah, that's a great question. So think about maybe what birds do, right? So when birds migrate for different seasons, why is it that they're migrating? They're moving from one area to another, and it's because they're responding to their current environment and trying to make it different by moving somewhere else. So that's an example of what we're talking about when we say responding to a stimulus. All right, Stefan, what are the main characteristics of life? It seems as if different sources have different answers. Oh, okay. So, main characteristics, there are 8 of them. And like I said, I wrote them here for you all, so I can just go through them very quickly. All right. In no specific order, they're made up of one or more cells. Homeostasis is another one. Ability to evolve. Next one is they have a genetic code, meaning DNA or RNA. Next one is they grow and develop. Ability to reproduce. Remember, it's not just reproduction, it's ability to reproduce. Metabolism, which we just talked about, and respond to environment or respond to a stimulus. Those are your 8 characteristics of life. Okay. Hi, Como. Can we go over biomagnification versus bioaccumulation? So Como, we went over this one, so I can go back over it again at the end. But if you rewatch this video, you will see that I went over it. So let's see if there are any more questions coming in. I see Roma's question. Could you also go over communication and signaling? Yeah, definitely. I feel like I keep saying definitely. All right, so communication and signaling. An example is something called the waggle dance that is done by bees. So when bees find pollen, when they find flowers somewhere, they try to give each other a message like, hey, that's where I found it. That's where you should go find it too. So they actually do a dance for each other. That dance, which is a really cool dance, by the way, there's a lot of math that goes into it too. It's incredible. So that dance is known as a form of communication and signaling. Okay, so another example of that could be if I'm approaching a dog and the dog is sort of showing me his teeth and it's growling. That dog is actually trying to communicate with me, and it's basically trying to say like, hey, don't get close because maybe this is scary, or I'm afraid of you, or I'm about to kick your butt. Any of those things. So that's another form of communication and signaling. All right, Jonathan, would a mother bear kicking out their cubs when they're grown be considered as parent conflict? I guess so. I guess it could be a form of parent conflict. You know, in any situation where you have the parents and the offspring not getting along, yeah, you could see it that way. So that's okay. I'll take that. Can you please go over respiration a little bit? So if you're talking about cellular respiration, that question is coming from Nitin. Hi, Nitin. Cell respiration is something that we are going to dive into in so much detail. And I don't want to bog your mind right now with all that unnecessary information. And I call it unnecessary because I'm going to teach you so much about it. You're going to learn the ins and outs of it. And right now, I don't want to go there just yet, but I will get there for you, Nitin. You'll see. Okay, let's see. Alex, will the quiz be all multiple choice? Hi, Alex. The quiz, a lot of it is multiple choice. Yes, a lot of it. The C-level question is mostly multiple choice. B-level question, same. And the A-level question you already have access to. Remember, I'm going to pull one of those A-level questions. I give you 4, and you'll be answering one of them. Okay? All right. Isn't that like what all bears do? Going back to our former question, like kick out their kids or their cubs. Yeah. Yeah. If at some point the parent and the offspring no longer want to be associated with each other, there's a little conflict there. It doesn't mean that it's anything big, but yeah, there's a little conflict. Totally. Okay, Ronit, I didn't understand the A-level question where a person kept eating tuna and we had to explain why it was bad for him or her. Could you elaborate what this means? Yes. So that I decided to go with tuna because it's kind of typical for fish to have toxins just because of the amount of mercury that's in the waters and the oceans. So let's see. How do I want to go about this? So imagine if there's some kind of toxin. I know I just said mercury or whatever, but let's just talk about a toxin, DDT, whatever, just a toxin. if that toxin finds its way into a producer, and that producer is something that's eaten by a primary consumer, and that primary consumer is something that's eaten by a secondary consumer, and so on and so forth, it's that toxin is basically building its way or accumulating or magnifying through a system. So what happens, when a really large fish like tuna, which is really a top level consumer, kind of. So when tuna ends up eating a lot of that fish, a lot of the primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, tuna as a top level consumer, tuna is going to have a lot of toxin. And then if I'm going to eat that tuna, and I'm going to eat that tuna a lot, what do you think is going on in my body? So that's where I want you to go with that one. Okay, Stefan, in order for something to be considered alive, it has to satisfy all 8 characteristics of life, making viruses abiotic. Yes, Stefan, you are totally right, except remember there are some gray areas in all of this. So we talked about, in class, we talked about, what was it, mules or ligers. So those things don't necessarily have the ability to reproduce, but they are still considered biotic. So just remember that as well, that there are some gray areas in all of that. All right, Stefan, if a sterile animal such as a liger can't reproduce, how can you justify that it's alive? Yes. So you're totally right. And that's the gray area that we were just talking about. So that's an area where I think as scientists, we just have to be like, yeah, it's got one issue. And that one issue is that it doesn't have the ability to reproduce. So if you wanted to make the argument for why you feel like that should be considered abiotic, I will totally take it. But I will tell you that scientists agree that it would be considered biotic, even though it doesn't have the ability to reproduce. Okay. All right. So let's see. I'm looking for more questions. Ronit, is there one correct answer for viruses being abiotic or biotic, or is it your opinion? There is a correct answer, and the answer is that viruses are considered abiotic, right? But like I was just telling Stefan, it is totally fine if you want to make an argument for something else. So let's say I give you a CER, a claim evidence reasoning, as an A-level question, and I ask you to make an argument for whether viruses are biotic or abiotic. And if you want to stick with biotic and you want to give me an awesome CER for it, that's perfectly fine. All right. Nika, how is a leather purse considered biotic? Okay. So a leather purse, I know it's kind of silly. And I worry that talking about biotic and abiotic in this way actually kind of makes it more confusing. But the general rule of thumb is that if it comes from an animal, or if it came from an animal, it would be considered biotic. Which then kind of applies to a lot of things when you think about it. And I shouldn't have said animal. If it came from a living thing, if it came from a biotic thing. So that means that, the paper that you're touching, if it came from a tree, then that would be considered biotic too. That's why I'm saying it's kind of confusing. So I'd rather stick with, let's consider it biotic or abiotic based on the 8 characteristics of life. Okay. Okay, Alex, what is the difference between biomagnification and bioaccumulation? This is a very popular question. So, Alex, I answered this a little earlier. So, when this is all done, if you want to rewatch it, I did answer it, I think, a couple of times. All right. So, Anika, I thought that the amount of toxin stays the same when it's transferred. Why do you say that it builds up? Okay, great question. I love this question, Anika. It stays the same. You're totally right. The amount of toxin stays the same. But in comparison with the amount of energy, it's actually magnifying. So that's one thing. And that kind of relates to the question that Alex just asked too. And I see that this is a very popular topic tonight. So it is magnifying because when you look at the ratio of energy to toxin, you see that energy is decreasing as it's working its way through the system, but the toxin staying the same. So that's why we call it magnification. And we also call it accumulation or bioaccumulation because species end up eating more than one. So if you're eating something toxic in the environment, you're not just having that one thing, you're eating many of them. And that's why it's accumulating or building up in your system. All right, Anika, what are all the characteristics that viruses share with organisms? Anika, think, I assume you're asking like what are all the things that we have in common with viruses? Could you correct me if I'm wrong? Let me know, leave me a little comment and then I'll answer it. How's homeostasis different than responding to a stimulus? Okay, good question, Ria. So homeostasis is different because it's happening inside of your body. And it's happening sort of involuntarily, which means that we don't really have a say over it. Our body is doing it for us. Response to a stimulus could be something that we do, like birds migrating would be a response to an environment or a stimulus. Okay, let's see. Stefan's asking, will there be ECE ratios on the exam? No, there will not be ECE ratios on the exam. That was extra credit, and I want to make sure that I don't put things that are extra credit on the exam. Roma, what is the energy pyramid? So Roma, if I could draw an energy pyramid for you right now, so I'll draw my fingers. It basically looks like this, right? And in the bottom trophic level, you have producers, and then it builds up and it goes to, I shouldn't say builds up, it then goes to primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and so on and so forth. So that's the energy pyramid. It basically shows that the amount of energy is decreasing throughout the system with each trophic level because of the 10% rule. Nitin, are we supposed to convert ECE ratios to percentages? No, you won't have to worry about that tomorrow at all. Anika, that's what you were asking. Awesome. Okay, so let's see what things we have in common with viruses. So Anika, we are made up of cells. Viruses do not have cells, right? No cells. It's just basically protein, and it's just got some genetic code. Homeostasis, they don't do homeostasis. We do. We do evolve, so do they. They do evolve. Genetic code, that's kind of a tricky one. Yeah, it's going to be able to kind of sort of, that's a tricky one. Let me come back to that one. Grow and develop, they can't grow and develop, and we can. Ability to reproduce, yes, they can, but they need to have a host. So that's kind of a yes, but. Metabolism, we do metabolism, they don't. Response to environment, we do respond to the environment. And I guess in a way you could say that viruses do too, right? They do respond to an environment. But yeah, it's one of the reasons viruses are so tricky, just some of the stuff that they do. So the other part is genetic code with viruses. So they actually sort of use us, they use our cells to be able to pass on their genes. And so a lot of what they do is kind of like, if they have this, if they have that, and without it, they won't be able to do any of that. I hope that makes sense. All right, Connor, ECE ratio. So Connor, that has to do, that's for the extra credit, and it has to do with what I was trying to get through with that part with the ECE ratios was to show you that the 10% rule applies, but it's not exactly 10%. So we teach it that way and we talk about it that way, but it's not exactly 10%. That's really what I was going after for those, for that. Okay, Ronit, provide us with a couple examples of homeostasis. Yeah, Ronit, so one of them is our blood glucose level in our body, right? Another one is, think about when your body, say you're in a really kind of hot environment, right? Super hot. What does your body start doing? Your body starts to sweat. Why is it sweating? Because that sweat is going to ultimately cool you down. So there's just a couple examples. Now, the second example I gave you could also be applied to responding to environment. So that's one that could be used for both of them. Hi, Arya. Difference between homeostasis and metabolism. Arya, metabolism has to do with breaking down food for energy. So it's cell respiration. Homeostasis is our body's ability to maintain a stable internal environment. Surya, what would the amount of toxin be the same as the trophic level goes on? Because Surya, so imagine if a rabbit ate a carrot and that carrot had 10 milligrams, I'm just making that number up, 10 milligrams of a toxin. That rabbit is also getting that 10 milligrams that came from the carrot. And then if I eat that rabbit, which I don't eat rabbits, but if I ate the rabbit, then I would also get 10 milligrams. That's why that number stays the same. Arnav, is needing insects for the pollination of flowers considered reproducing as a species for the flowers? Needing insects as the pollination of flowers. Oh, that's a great question. It still counts as reproduction, Arnav, because although pollination is huge and without it, a lot of our system would go down, it still counts as, yeah, they do have the ability to reproduce. But you're right, they do need something, kind of like what we talked about with viruses. All right, Stefan, what are some examples of innate behaviors? Okay, so an innate behavior is like if you ever see newborn birds, and by that I mean like as soon as the egg cracks, the shell cracks, and the birds are kind of out, they see their mom and they start opening their beaks already, right? And that's not something they've learned. They haven't learned like, hey, mom's going to feed us. That's an innate behavior that's in them already. So an innate behavior is something that an organism is born with, whereas a learned behavior is something that you learn throughout your experiences. Okay. Hey, John, what are parts of behavioral ecology? What parts of behavioral ecology do we need to know and understand? So, John, what I would need you to know is the different topics that we covered. So each group had a different topic. So making sure that you understand the basics of all of those topics is what I would need you to understand. Como, is sleep an example of homeostasis? Let's see. So your body does a ton of homeostasis while you sleep. So kind of in a way. So sleeping is something that we sort of in a way choose to go to sleep when we choose to go to sleep, unless you're extremely tired and you just fall asleep. But while you're asleep, there is a tremendous amount of homeostasis that's taking place in your body. All right, I don't see any questions. So I'm going to take a sip of my carrot juice. Let me know if there's any more questions coming up. And if I don't see any questions, I can just read off the list that I have. Sure, John, I can define metabolism. So metabolism is our body's ability to break down food and break it into really small molecules and eventually glucose. Run it. What are mating strategies? Okay, so mating strategies. Let's talk about like some birds, like peacocks even. They like to show off. So in a lot of different species, the male likes to show off. Is that true for humans? So when you think about birds, a lot of these birds, they like to sort of do different things with their feathers, or some of them like to build little kind of homes almost. They'll go and grab shiny things to impress females. Some of them will do a little dance for the female. And then there are other species where some males actually fight to not necessarily to the death, but they fight, and whoever wins basically is the winner and gets the female. So those are different types of mating strategies. Arya, how's altruism different from kin selection? So we went over this a little earlier. I'll just go over it again. So altruism is when you do something out of the goodness of your heart for usually a different species, right? So you find like I don't know, there's a student that came to me a couple years ago. She had found a lizard on campus, and the lizard couldn't walk. And she brought the lizard and was like, we got to help this lizard, which was really sweet. Kin selection really has to do more with the behavior that you're showing, which is in a way kind of altruistic. That behavior is going to ultimately benefit you or your species in some way. So if you're doing something for a member of your species, even though you could be doing out of the goodness of your heart, science shows that there's actually a part of our brain that's doing it because we want our genes as a species to be able to be passed on. So that's what the difference is. Okay, that was my short explanation. I hope that helped, Arya. Surya, what is the amount of toxin? Why does the amount of toxin, why would it still be the same? It would be the same because you're eating that organism. So if it has 10 milligrams of a toxin, you're consuming all 10 of those milligrams of the toxin, right? And then if something else eats you, they're consuming all 10 of those milligrams of the toxin. So the amount of toxin doesn't change, but the amount of energy changes. All right, John, if 90% of the energy is emitted to the environment as heat, where is the other 10% going? Great question. The other 10% is used for whatever that organism wants to use it for, right? Organisms have different things that they want to do with that energy, and that's what it's used for. The 90% is stuff that your body has to do. metabolism, homeostasis, like all that stuff takes energy. And that's where the 90% goes. The other 10% is left for you as an organism to use. Is commensalism a form of altruism in a way? That's such a great question. Who's asking me this question? Nitin, nice job. Commensalism, I don't know that I would put those two together, Nitin. Commensalism is basically when you have one organism that is benefiting, the other one that's not being harmed or helped. I don't know. I don't know that I would put those two together, Nitin. I'm going to think about that some more, but I'm going to say no for now. Let's see. Roned, you didn't completely understand the difference between a food chain and a food web? Sure. So a food chain is very linear. A food chain is basically, it just shows you one line. It shows you that there's a producer and the primary consumer eats the producer, the secondary consumer eats the primary consumer, and so on, right? It's not very realistic. A food web is much more realistic because it shows you everything in that ecosystem as far as like all the biotic things. So it shows you all the producers, all the primary consumers, all the secondary consumers. It shows you everything. So a food web is a much more realistic depiction of ecosystems than a food chain would be. A food chain we just talk about for simplicity reasons. Okay, Ria, hello to you too. Talk about the difference between biomagnification and bioaccumulation. Ria, so welcome. We talked about this one. This has been probably the most popular topic so far. And I'm gonna, at the end, if you have extra time, I'll talk about it again. But it's something that we talked about. So if you replay this video, you'll be able to watch that. So I'm gonna move on to our next one. Stefan, kin selection is more for selfish reasons compared to altruism. So I'm making it sound that way, Stefan, but it's not really like selfish because you're trying to be selfish. It's not a conscious thing. It's just kind of an evolutionary thing where, like, you know, we want things in a way, like innately we want our genes as a family or as a species to go on. So yeah, you're totally on the right path, but yeah. All right, John, do we need to know the different types of monogamy and polygamy? No, I just want you to be able to understand what monogamy is and what polygamy is. Arya, can you say that a food web is just multiple food chains combined? Yeah, you could say that a food web is when you put a lot of food chains together and make it much more realistic. Sure. Arnav, would a food web be multiple food chains put together? Yes. Yep, you and Arya had very similar questions. Thank you, Ria. I will go back to this, to the idea of biomagnification and bioaccumulation at the end. It is a very popular topic, so. All right, John, what is respiration? So respiration is this idea of cellular respiration, which is a more specific term for metabolism. And so it's when your body ends up breaking down the food that you're consuming, and it breaks it up into smaller pieces. Safwan, would they be interconnected? Yes. So I think you're talking about the food webs and the food chain thing. So yes, they would be interconnected because you're putting a lot of food chains together. So you're going to see a ton of connections. And then just to remind you, it is very possible for an organism to be a tertiary consumer and a secondary consumer and a primary, a quaternary. Like, think about us as humans, right? We are many of those things. Roma, on the quiz, if we're given an example of symbiosis, we'll have to know the organism involved in the example. No, Roma, I'm much more interested in you being able to determine the type of relationship. Soft one, the food chains and the food web would be interconnected. Yes, they would be. John, is respiration where the body breaks down food to convert food molecules into chemical or kinetic energy? Yes, John, but remember, respiration, really, cell respiration, it breaks down all those food molecules. When you say, chemical or kinetic energy, you are right, but I want to remind you that it's really ATP. We're trying to make energy in the form of ATP, but you are right by saying what you said. Ronit, what does the term response to stimuli mean in characteristics of life? It just means that you respond to something in a way that benefits you, right? So we talked about birds migrating. So you're responding to your environment to put yourself in a better place as a bird to be able to survive. So that's what that means. All right, I see the question stopped coming for now, so I'm going to take another sip of my carrot juice and give you a moment. Nitin, ATP is adenosine triphosphate. You don't have to know that just yet, so don't worry about that. I promise to teach you that down the road, but it's basically, instead of saying to create energy, we can say to create ATP, which is a specific form of energy. That's what that means. Hey, now I have Dakota here laying with me and Kuchuk somewhere else. Kuchuki, where'd you go? I hear her somewhere. Okay, Surya, what's the difference between bioaccumulation? Oh, Surya, you are asking the question of the night. So I think I'm gonna respond to this again at the end of this video because I'm getting this question so much. So hold on to that, and I will respond to it. It'll probably just be kind of our cap for the video when we get to the end in about 10 to 15 minutes. All right, unless I don't see any more questions, in which case I guess I'd be happy to answer it. Or I can also look at the questions that I got from a lot of you in class. So as you're thinking, I'm gonna maybe answer some of these questions. Yeah, hope that works. Let's see. Someone asked, will we have to compose our own CER on the test? Let's see. So the 4 questions that I gave you for the A-level question, that's what you'll need to know. So oftentimes, one of those questions might be a CER, in which case I will be giving it to you in advance. All right, make sure you know what a trophic level is. Let's see. Yeah, I see that biomagnification question on here too. It's a good one. Let's see. John, do we need to memorize our waterways flowchart? Okay, that's a good question, John. So I personally don't like the idea of memorization. I don't know that it's really the way to go, but I also understand where you're coming from. So you do need to know where water goes. You do need to know, when you flush your toilet, where's water go? When you turn on your sink, where's water coming from? So you do need to know that. I don't know. I guess if memorization is what you need to do between now and tomorrow, then yeah. But ultimately, I would love for you to be able to just kind of know where all that stuff goes. Maybe make flashcards to help you with it. But it is something that I did ask several times on the quiz when I was making it. Okay. What else you got? Quickly go over waterways. Yeah, Nitin. So we went over this earlier. I'd be happy to go over it again. It only came up, I think, once. So with waterways, remember, so there's the natural water cycle where you got evaporation, transpiration, condensation, precipitation, and remember, watershed is also part of the natural water cycle. And then you have the other stuff. You have reservoirs, which is man-made. You have aquifers, which are not man-made. Actually, let's talk about aquifers real quick too, because someone asked that question in here. How are aquifers recharged? I think a lot of you can answer this question, but basically we build percolation ponds on top of aquifers, and the water from a percolation pond recharges the aquifer, and that way the above surface, the ground level, doesn't collapse because of that gigantic amount of air that's there. So you want to always keep an aquifer recharged. The other thing that you should all know about is saltwater intrusion. So if you have an aquifer that's close to the ocean and a lot of water is being taken out of that aquifer, it's possible that by taking out so much water, you're allowing salt water from the ocean to underground to enter your aquifer. And when that happens, now you have a combination of salt water and fresh water, right? And that's brackish. And when that happens, you can't drink that water from the aquifer anymore. So yeah. Okay. Nitin, I hope that was helpful. That was kind of a short way of doing that. Ronit, does genetic code fall into the category of DNA and RNA? Yes, it does. Yep. Surya, how many questions are there going to be for the test? Surya, I think, so I'm going to ballpark it. I apologize. I don't remember the exact number. I think there's something right under 20, I think, for sea levels. I think we have something like 10 for B levels and then 1 for A level. So that's the number of questions you're getting. Anika, can you explain what a watershed is? Yeah, absolutely. So a watershed is basically an area where a lot of water runoff, a lot of rivers, a lot of, when it rains, when it snows, all of that, gravity is taking it into this one area. And that one area is called a watershed. And sometimes, as humans, what we do is we want to keep that water in the area. So we build dams and we call that a reservoir. Okay. All right. John, how can you define biotic and abiotic? I would define it based on the 8 characteristics of life, John. So that's what I would fall on, while remembering that there are some gray areas. By the way, John, I think I see a picture of a dog, and that is adorable. Roma, if there weren't percolation ponds, could aquifers stay charged? Yeah, Roma, they could stay charged, but the aquifers that have percolation ponds on top of them, that's really kind of a making sure that you're safe. So that's playing it safe. So it really all depends on the amount of rain that you get. So if you're not getting a whole lot of recharge by precipitation, it's a good idea to have a percolation pond. So, and especially nowadays with everything that's going on with our climate. Okay, let's see. Yeah, no problem, Nathan. John, can you explain a biomass pyramid? So John, biomass, basically, we didn't really go over this in class, so I won't get into it too much because I don't want to confuse you or anybody, but biomass is this idea that like it's the amount of actual like mass that there is per trophic level. That's really what biomass kind of refers to. And I'd be happy to show you that sometime. It looks kind of funky. If you look it up, like type in biomass for like any ecosystem, and it looks weird because the producer level, the trophic level for producers is tiny, and then it gets bigger. See for yourself. It's actually kind of interesting. Okay, Arya, if salt water gets mixed into an aquifer, would that aquifer be useless? Yes, it would be useless. Arnav, would a snake killing its prey with a venom over time be considered parasitism or predator and prey? That would still be predator and prey, Arnav. It would not be parasitism. Stefan, A-level questions are the hardest, right? Yeah, students usually find A-level questions the hardest, but please make sure that it is still the last question that you answer because it is only worth about 10% of your grade. The A-level question really separates your grade between sort of an A and a B. That's kind of how I see it. So go for the C-level questions first. Remember, this is going to be your first quiz in bio. I think you've probably all taken quizzes so far in high school, but remember that if you're stuck, your first guess is usually the correct choice. Just got to remember that too. It might help you out. Can you go over behavioral ecology review? That's coming from Surya. So Surya, behavioral ecology review. There are the 8. So I'll go over the 8 that I've written down here that I would like everyone to know. So there's communication and signaling, innate versus learned behaviors, territorial behavior, parental care and investment, parent-offspring conflict, altruism and kin selection, monogamy versus polygamy, and mating strategies and tactics. Let me know if there's one of those that you want me to go over. Let's see. Nika, is rainwater 100% safe to drink? Yes, typically it is. Yeah, it should be good to go because it's very clean. Ronit, could you also go over the 10% rule? Sure, the 10% rule basically means that each time you consume something, you're only getting 10% of its energy as usable energy. The other 90% is used on bodily processes such as homeostasis and metabolism. Will biomass pyramid be on the quiz? No, John, it will not be on the quiz because I didn't teach it to you and I don't want to surprise you with that. Safwan, will we need to know the rules from the triple E packet by name? Safwan, what do you mean by that? Tell me what you mean. Yana, will we be assessed on behavioral ecology? Yes, you will, but it'll be very basic. Avi, if a person eats tuna a lot, is that an example of bioaccumulation or biomagnification? Ooh, such a great question, Avi. So if I'm eating a lot of tuna, that's an example of bioaccumulation. But you can also refer to how it's biomagnification because that tuna has so much toxin in it because of the amount of energy that's decreasing through the system, but the amount of toxin that's staying constant through the system. So I would refer more to bioaccumulation. What an awesome question. You got me thinking over there, Avi. Hi, Shivali. Main difference between food chains and food webs. So Shivali, we talked about this earlier. We talked about how food chains are just linear and not really realistic and kind of simplified, and food webs are much more interconnected. All right. John, what is homeostasis? John, homeostasis is an organism's ability to be able to keep an stable internal environment. So we talked about, for example, sugar, your blood sugar, and how your body constantly, keeps it in this one area, regardless of how much you've eaten or how much you haven't eaten. Yana, go over parental care and investment. Sure, Yana. So there are many species or organisms that take different care of their offspring. Some of them spend a long time, like humans, typically spend a long time with their offspring before the offspring go, and there are other ones that don't spend as much time. So it's this idea of like taking care of your offspring and kind of setting them up for success. Let's see, John, I think soft one means the rules of thermodynamics. Oh, let's see. I think it's a good idea to know the rules of thermodynamics in general. Yeah. Yep, soft one. I hope that helps. John, can you define bioaccumulation? Yes, I'm going to do this at the end of the video because it is the most popular question. I was not expecting that, but I'll definitely go over it. Como, is there a way to get rid of the toxins in an animal that we eat before eating it? So unfortunately, Como, no, there's no way to do that. I know for humans, if you end up having a lot of toxin in you, a lot of times it's just giving it time, really giving it time. But if it's stuff that you're eating, there's no way to remove that toxin, unfortunately. Yeah. Good question. Nika, what's an example of kin selection? Nika, an example of kin selection is when you help someone of your own species usually, and you're doing that because even though you're helping out of the goodness of your heart, you want, evolutionary, our brains like, hey, well, if I help this person, then our genes as a species are gonna go on and they'll be able to reproduce. Surya, does precipitation directly go into the bay? Yeah, it can. If it rains into the bay, then for sure. And by the bay, if you mean the estuary, then yes. Nitin, can you explain altruism? Yeah, Nitin, altruism is helping out another organism out of the goodness of your heart. And it's typically not an organism that is your species. So it's like you helping out an animal, right? Helping out the animal doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be able to pass on your human genes. And that makes it altruism. Is kin selection subconscious? Yeah, Como, it's not something that we think about, right? So like, when we help each other through life, we don't necessarily think, if we help each other, we're going to be able to pass on our genes. It's just something that's there. Anika, what is the difference between a bay and an estuary? Anika, I love this question so much. We live in the estuary area. A bay, if you know what I want you to do, if you really want to understand the difference, just go to your Google search and type in Monterey Bay and see a picture of it from up above, like a satellite view of it, and you'll see that it kind of looks like a sort of like a crescent kind of shape. Whereas if you look at an estuary, it does not look like that. A bay is going to have salt water. An estuary is going to have a lot of brackish water, which is a combination of salt water and fresh water. So we live in an estuary, not a bay. Although I live right in between a bay and an estuary because I'm a little more south than you all. Okay. Arya, is kin selection specific to only your children or your species too? Yeah, Arya. So it's basically, it's family, it's species, because we're trying to make sure that kind of our genes pass on. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. All right. Any other questions coming my way? Is everybody ready for the quiz tomorrow? Hopefully, everyone's going to kick butt on this quiz. Looking to see if there are any more questions coming. Nitin, rules of thermodynamics. So Nitin, just for the sake of time, I'm going to refer you to the top of our triple E packet, where it talks about the two rules of thermodynamics, right? It's all about energy and how it can't be created or destroyed, and it's transferred, and that's what we're referring to. Como, yeah, altruism really quickly. Altruism is when you help out an organism that's typically not in your species, and you're doing it to help them out of the goodness of your heart. That's what altruism is. Think about whether you have altruistic behaviors or not. I think it's a really cool thing to think about as a person. Like where are you at with your own altruistic thoughts or behaviors? John, do we need to know the most important and least important species in the food web? John, I love this question. Yeah, it is really important to know what species could make a big difference in a food web or an ecosystem. So knowing something like keystone species would be good. Jenna, you forgot the discussion in class, but why does a room warm up when there are people in it? So it's because of the amount of bodily processes that are taking place. So all that cell respiration or metabolism, all the homeostasis, all those things that are happening is actually creating heat, right? And that heat is being given off into the environment or the surroundings. And so that's why a room heats up over time. What defines, let's see, where'd the question go? Oh, looks like I skipped a couple. What defines a toxin? Who's Light Star 9? All right, whoever you are. What defines a toxin? If it's something that's going to damage your body in some way, it is going to be a toxin, right? It's something that's usually consumed. Producers and top-level consumers versus middle area. Yeah, John, so definitely no keystone species. Okay, I answered Jenna's question. Jonathan, can you provide some examples of homeostasis again, really quick? Yeah, an example, John, is if you think about blood sugar, right? So your body and its ability to maintain its blood sugar, not letting it get too high or get too low. Anika, what are the most important and least important species in a food web? So Anika, I would say keystone species are really important. So make sure that you take a look at your EEE key where we talk about keystone species. Shivali, what's an example of a commensalistic relationship in our life? So we randomly asked that question, but don't feel like you have to answer that question. It's a relationship in which you gain something positive and the other person or the other organism is just kind of meh about it, right? Soft one, my question has been soft one. I'm sorry, buddy. How did I skip your question? Ask your question again. I don't know what you were asking. I'm sorry. Ask it again. Roma, could producers in a food web cause damage if one species of them is removed? Yes. Typically, when you remove anything in a food web, it can actually damage the ecosystem, but some things damage it more than others. Keystone species are the things that damage it really bad. Ronit, since near the end of the stream, could you explain the difference between? Yeah, I will definitely get to it. I promise, Ronit. Hi, Jana. Explain kin selection. So Jana, I explained kin selection and altruism a few times. So if you don't mind, I'm going to skip that one. Watch this video again, and I'll have explained it a few times. Yana, what is stimuli? So it's basically anything that causes you to have a reaction, whether it's the temperature outside or it's something touching you. That's all stimulus or stimuli. Stefan, in a food web, if an organism is first and secondary consumer, which trophic level would it go into? Good question. We could put it into both, actually. Yeah. Viba, how do we know how much toxin is in an animal or a plant? How do we know, like, for the quiz, how do we know? Or how do we know in real life, how do we know, Viba? Because in real life, we kind of know because we can actually measure how much toxin is in an environment, like when we look at fish. With stuff like that, you can kind of tell, but I wouldn't be asking you that question on the quiz because that's really complex. All right, Jana, define homeostasis. Jana, homeostasis is when your body is able to maintain a stable internal environment, so something like blood sugar balance. All right, hi Ruhi, nice to see you. Ruhi, keystone species are species that are really important to an ecosystem. They're usually Usually top level consumers, they're predators. They're not always top level consumers. And usually if something happens to them, the entire ecosystem in a way kind of crashes sometimes, right? Because when their population declines, their prey start to kind of really explode and take over. So keystone species, big deal. All right, let me see. I've answered it. Okay, thank you, soft one. I'm glad, and I'm sorry if I was ignoring it. I didn't do it on purpose. Surya, can you go over associative learning and monogamy versus polygamy? So Surya, associative learning, we talked about how it's kind of like, I was talking about my dogs and how they hear, as soon as they hear a cutting board, they know that that means food from dad. So that's associative learning, is when you take two things in your brain and you link them together, not necessarily on purpose. Monogamy versus polygamy is monogamy is having one mate, choosing to be with one mate. Polygamy is having many mates. And this is usually like at a time. So one mate at a time or many mates at a time. Vibha, are plants keystone species? Typically, no. Typically, they're not. Ruhi, wasn't the live stream supposed to start at 7? Ruhi, I'm very sorry. We changed it up, and I sent something in Google Classroom saying that it was going to start at 6 o'clock. But you can definitely still watch it. So once this is done, once I click end, it's going to go up on my YouTube channel, and you can watch it and fast forward through it and all that good stuff. So I apologize. Arya, how are aqueducts used? Arya, aqueducts are used in that we use them to transport water from one place to another. So it's a half pipe. It's a really large half pipe, and it's not covered. So it's going to take water from, say, Northern California to Southern California to a water treatment plant. Arnav, example of keystone species. Arnav, the wolves in Yellowstone would be an example of that. We talked about that in third period today. So it's when you have an organism or species within an ecosystem, and when that species number starts to decline, you see a huge impact on the rest of the ecosystem. Let's see, John. Yes, Mr. Jones, I think, does have a live stream. I'm going to get a hold of Mr. Jones right now and see if he's got the live stream. So let me shoot Mr. Jones a text right now and ask, when's your live stream? By the way, the live stream just came out as love steam. I did not mean that. When is your live stream? All right. Let's see if he gets back to me. He might be exercising. Okay. Let's see. Komal, can we go over biomagnification and bioaccumulation? Yeah, I will do it in just a moment. Water energy pyramid. So Surya energy pyramid is the pyramid that I showed you with different trophic levels where energy is moving up through a system and it's decreasing as it's moving through each trophic level. John, can water from reservoirs go straight to a water treatment plant? Yes, it can. Arnav, no problem. Thank you for saying thank you. Arya, since it's not a full pipe, won't the water get dirt or other things in it? Yeah, Arya, it does actually. I don't think it's a great system personally. It can get dirt in it, but the good thing is that it goes straight to a water treatment plant. So we're good. We're covered. Vibha, can rainwater go to a water treatment plant directly? So Vibha, we don't have the infrastructure in our cities to actually do that. I wish we did, but rainwater can't directly go to a water treatment plant. I wish we had better ways of collecting rainwater throughout our cities, but we don't, because a lot of rainwater goes straight into storm drains, which is then kind of wasted. Hey, Mr. Jones responded. Let's see. He says 8 p.m. So Mr. Jones has a live stream at 8 p.m. And you're more than welcome to join his. And he's awesome, so he will answer your questions as well. Okay, I'm going to say thank you because I don't want to be rude. Let's say thanks. I'm telling him that I'm just about to finish mine. All right. Okay, so what else we got? Arya, you mean for aquifers, since it's not a full pipe? For aquifers. Arya, I don't know what you mean. Can you tell me what you mean? Stefan, plants are the bottom of the trophic pyramid. How come they aren't keystone species? Stefan, the reason for that is because producers, since there are many of them, different primary consumers, they don't just rely on one type of plant. That's usually the reason why. John, what is Mr. Jones's YouTube channel? So John, I know he's got a YouTube channel. He has an old one. So if you look for Kyle Jones, so I would type in Kyle Jones MV for Monte Vista, MV Biology. You'll see a couple pop up. There's one with a picture of Jones, me, and Mr. Gann. That's the old one. Don't go to that one. He's got a new one. And that's one with just a picture of him. Okay. Connor, how much water is evaporated through aqueducts? Yeah, Connor, I don't know the amount, but you bring up a really good point. Water can be evaporated through aqueducts too. So that's one of the other reasons why I wonder why they're not covered. Okay. Arya, you already answered my question. Thank you. No problem, Arya. My pleasure. Jana, transpiration is basically evaporation of water through plant leaves. That's what transpiration is. Let's see. Jonathan says, search him up on YouTube. Yeah, search up. It's Mr. Jones MV. There you go. Thanks, Ronit. Go to Mr. Jones MV. I think that should pop it up for you. It's him with a beanie. Yeah, that sounds familiar. I think so. It is Mr. Jones MV. Who's Raindrop? Hi, Raindrop. I thought that the Triple E packet said that producers were keystone species, but you just said it wasn't a keystone species. So, John, keystone species typically are top level producers, right? So, is it possible for a producer to be a keystone species? Yes, but typically they're top level producers, not always. I hope I didn't confuse you more, John. Surya, go over altruism. So Surya, I covered altruism and kin selection a few times, so I'm gonna leave that one if you don't mind, and you can rewatch this and kind of gain some more knowledge in that. Stefan, are producers as a whole keystone species? Are producers as a whole keystone species? Ooh, good question. Yes, but they're not called that. Producers as a whole are so important to the ecosystem for obvious reasons. Okay, top level consumers, not producers, right? Yes, John, you are right. What are examples of top level producers? Did I say top level producers? If I said that, I'm sorry. I did not mean top level producers. I meant top level consumers. Raindrop, you are a junior now, just checking out your stream. Good going. All right. Hi, Raindrop. Raindrop, was I your teacher or did you have somebody else who was even more awesome as your teacher? Soft one, you mean top level? Yes, I do mean top level consumers. I'm really sorry for saying top level producers. That is terrible. I meant top level consumers. Jana, what's the difference between decomposers and detritivores? So Jana, we talked about this a little earlier. I'll just go over it again. Detritivores are organisms that go after dead stuff. So like vultures, they find something that's dead and they try to consume it for energy. Decomposers take that to another level and really break it down to a very small level. So like worms or bacteria. Cool. All right. Raindrop, you had Mr. Jones. All right. You are lucky to have had Mr. Jones. He's awesome. Viva, are Venus flytraps producers and first consumers? Ooh, I've heard this question before. Venus flytraps, I guess, I'm not 100% sure, but I think I would assume yes, that they are producers. But here's the thing though, they're producers, yeah, they can make their own food. I guess so. Yeah, I think so, Viva. Jonathan, can you explain by? Yes, I can. All right, let's go. It's the end of our live stream, so I am going to explain that. But before that, Stefan, I thought the very top and bottom of a trophic pyramid were keystone species. The very top and bottom. It is very possible for that to be. So, Stefan, the reason why I don't want to make a general rule is because each ecosystem is so different. But I like the way that I like the idea of thinking of a very top and the very bottom of an ecosystem of trophic levels of an energy pyramid as the really important parts. So that is totally fine to look at it that way because you would be correct. Oh, Jonathan, you don't think that Venus flytraps have photosynthesis? I don't know. I have no idea. I would love to learn more about Venus flytraps, but I don't know enough about them. Okay, so Viba are detritivores, scavengers. Yes, in a way. Okay. All right, so here we go. This is the end of our live stream. I'm going to talk about biomagnification and bio accumulation. I almost forgot that word. One more time. Okay, you ready? Biomagnification is this process where when an organism, would eat something that has a toxin in it, and the amount of toxin that it's eating, so a rabbit eating a carrot, if the carrot has 10 milligrams of a toxin, the rabbit is also gaining 10 milligrams of a toxin. That toxin is not going anywhere but into the body of the rabbit. However, as you already know, the amount of energy decreases for that rabbit. So the rabbit is getting only 10% of the energy of the carrot. Okay. And when you follow that throughout a system, the ratio is changing. So ratio earlier was 10 milligrams of a toxin to, let's just say, 10,000 kilojoules, right, for the carrot. And then you go on to the rabbit and you go on to something else. And ultimately, you still see 10 milligrams of the toxin with a much lower number for kilojoules for energy. So that ratio difference, that should explain biomagnification. Because as a toxin works its way through a system, through its trophic levels, the toxin amount stays the same, but the amount of energy decreases. That's why we see the upside down pyramid, because the toxin stays the same, the energy decreases, and therefore the amount of toxin throughout the system is magnifying, which is why we call it biomagnification. Bioaccumulation is slightly different in that organisms never just eat one thing, they eat many things. And if each one of those things has a toxin in it, you are building up or accumulating the amount of toxin in your body. And that is called bioaccumulation. I see more questions. Jennifer has joined us. Hi, Jennifer. Jennifer, detritivores, I answered that one, Jennifer, already. So re-watch this if you have time. Let's see. Jonathan, I can't wait to talk to you about Venus flytraps because I'm actually really curious now. John, both vocabulary words. Yeah, John, bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So to magnify is to make bigger, right? So biomagnification is this idea that throughout the system, the amount of toxin is getting bigger, which means that if you look at each trophic level, the toxin is sort of magnifying because the toxin is staying the same, but the energy level is decreasing. Therefore, we talk about it as increasing. The whole thing is increasing. Whereas accumulation has to do with building up. So if I have a ton of tuna and all that tuna has a lot of toxin in it, I'm building up a lot of toxin in my body. Therefore, I'm accumulating that toxin. All right, Jana, couldn't the animal just eat more producers without toxin to increase energy? It can, Jana, but not all animals have that choice. So what if you're talking about a carnivore, right? Jana, what would it mean for water used to be sustained? So Jana, what I'm talking about is sustainability means, can we use water in a way where it's a renewable resource? And we talked about how water itself is a renewable resource, but drinkable water is not. So we have to be careful about what we do with our drinkable water. And I think that as humans with climate change and what's happening, that we haven't fully adjusted to it. John, do you mean the toxin is increasing as the ratio to energy, or is it magnifying? So John, what I mean is that the amount of toxin is staying the same, but the energy is decreasing. And the combination of those two things means that it's magnifying. That's what I mean. I hope that clarifies it instead of confusing you more. All right. Anika, why isn't it reusable? Because the amount of drinkable water that we don't know how much precipitation we're going to get any given year, right? Especially with climate change. So drinkable water is not guaranteed, whereas water is. Most of the planet is made up of water, but drinkable water is a very small percentage of that. Okay. All right, everybody. I am going to head off and go do some more grading and maybe take these doggos for a walk. Thank you very much for joining me. Once I hit pause, this will be available again for you to watch. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I appreciate you being here with me. Thanks a lot. Have a good rest of your night. And if you want to join Mr. Jones's live stream, I'm sure he would love it. Take care, everybody.